All right. Let's get this going here. All right, there we go. All right. Well, sorry about last week, brothers. I'm part of a ministry that provides services to women who are considering abortion, and to show them, give them alternatives. It's a gospel-centered ministry, Southern California. So I'm on the board of that ministry, and they called a meeting sort of last minute at the same time we were meeting. So I apologize for having to cancel last week, but it's been neat to see the Lord working through that ministry, and just young women who are in difficult situations considering abortion, and just being able to offer them some alternatives. We found that when women actually see an ultrasound of their baby, about 70 to 75% of them choose to not abort the baby. So it has a tremendous effect, because you're right, you're looking at this little child and you can see it's a baby. The heart's beating. And so we're really trying to get women to come into the facility so that they can have an ultrasound, and then at the same time the nurses and the people there share Christ with them. And so it's a really neat ministry. So anyway, I was involved in that last week. That's why I had to cancel. So thank you for your patience. With that, we have had a couple weeks off here from our study in the narratives, kind of our review of the narrative process. And so looking forward to jumping back into that today and looking at John 4 as our example of passage. And just to keep our little step or process in front of us, of course, we're looking at the narrative analysis, which is the core distinctive step within narratives. All the other steps are pretty much the same in both the study and preaching step or manuscript sermon steps, except for the narrative analysis. And then for the sermon manuscript, there are a few differences as well that we'll review when we get to that. But for the narrative analysis, we started that, and we were reminding ourselves the 4 steps that we cover in narrative analysis are the character, setting, scene, and plot. And if you've looked at other books on narratives and stories, you may see some other key elements of narratives that they separate out, such as maybe dialogue or narrator, but I incorporate those within these 4. So really these 4 capture an even broader number of story elements that you'll see in typically in books. And maybe the order of this, you'll see maybe different orders as people analyze stories, but we're starting with the characters of the story. And just to remember, when we do character analysis, these are the 4 steps of that. And the last couple of sessions together, we've been looking at the descriptions of each character. And if you'll remember in that, with each character, right, we had the key characters were the protagonists, the antagonists, and the foils, if there are some there. And so far in John 4, we've identified them, and we've talked about a few of them in detail. And so today we'll finish that step up, and Lord willing, get to the 4th step, and then maybe the setting. But before we get to that, I think it'd be good for us to read again together the whole story of Jesus and the woman at the well. BJ, we'll start with you. If you could read verses 1 to 6, and then Renee, if you could follow up and read the next section, then Tabs, and then Ents, and then Jason, and I don't remember how many after that, maybe Harris, and then Robbie. I forget how many paragraphs there are, but BJ, you want to start us off?
Yes, sir, please. Verse 1, therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Verse 6, and Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour.
There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore, the woman said to him, "How is that, or how is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then you get that living water? You are not greater than Jacob, and his sons and his cattle."
Tabs.
Verse 13. Jesus answered and yes, Pastor.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me okay?
Okay.
Yep.
Verse
Sorry.
13, Pastor.
Go ahead, Tabs.
Yes, I can, Pastor. Sorry. Okay, Pastor. Jesus answered and said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst, but the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw." He said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have correctly said, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have said truly."
Verse 19. The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshippers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth."
Verse 25. The woman said to him, I know that the Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all to us." Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. At this point, his disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman. Yet no one said, "What do you seek?" or "What do you speak? Why do you speak with her?" So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, "Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it?" They went out of the city and were coming to him.
Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples were saying to one another, No one brought him anything to eat, did he? Jesus said to them, My food is to do the will of him who sent me, and to accomplish his work. Do you not say there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. Already he who reaps is receiving wages, and is gathering fruit for eternal life, for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together.
Atong, if you're there, do you want to finish this last paragraph?
Yes, Pastor.
Good morning.
Good morning.
For in this case, the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. From that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified, He told me all the things that I have done. So when the Samaritans came to Jesus, they were asking him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. Many more believed because of his word, and they were saying to the woman, It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves and know that this is indeed the Savior of the world.
Great. Thank you. Okay, good. Now we've already focused attention the last couple of sessions together on key characters and looking at important dialogue, important actions, right? In this particular step of character analysis, we're trying to focus on each of the key characters and really the what they say and what they do that seems significant. So of course, Christ being the protagonist, he's the main character in the story. The antagonist, as we've discussed, is the cultural attitude really regarding the relationship between Jews and Samaritans, and even as expressed by the disciples when they were shocked at who Jesus was speaking to when they got back. The foils are, whoops, there's a third one here. I think the foils that we identified, again, foils are seem to be key characters in the story that serve as either a contrast or a comparison to the main characters. And so we have the disciples as foils in this story who are really surprised what Jesus is doing, interacting with the woman. The Samaritans who are openly accepting of Jesus as the Messiah, as the Jewish teacher. And then we have the Samaritan woman who seems to be almost a contrast to the or comparison to Christ, and how she goes to the people in her city to bring them the message of Christ, that Jesus is the Messiah has come. And so she's probably one of the more difficult characters in the story to see how they fit, but that's a place that I think she fits best. And then we didn't get to this. We left off at the narrator. As I've mentioned many times, I think the key to really understanding narratives and authorial intent in those narratives and the point of the story is to follow carefully the narrator. Even the most subtlest, the most seemingly insignificant statements by the narrator can be important in the story. And I think one example of this, I don't know if we've discussed this, so forgive me if we have, but I think it really struck me when I was preaching John chapter 9 several years ago. And you remember this chapter, the man born blind, and the whole interaction with him and Jesus, and then him and the Pharisees who were interrogating him, and then the parents, and then this whole thing about they couldn't accept that this man born blind had been healed by Jesus because he healed him on the Sabbath. And so they were trying to get the man to go back on the story or something. Well, in the story, if you remember, verse 6, of this story. Have we talked about this that you remember?
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Okay, so did we talk about the pool?
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys all remember that? If so, I'll just go back to John 4. I never can remember what I've said where. But yeah, the point was just there that the narrator comment here, that brief statement that he gives him, he tells us what the pool, what Siloam means. And it seems like an unimportant point, but when you look at it in the course of the whole story, it's actually a very significant point. Because the whole issue here in John 9, as in many of the chapters in John, is the authority of Christ, the identity of Christ. And Jesus keeps saying all throughout the gospel, I've been sent. I've been sent. He who sent me. And so the Pharisees continue to reject that. They didn't believe him to be the Messiah, but he keeps going to that. And so here in John 9, the narrator makes this little point. I think he spit on the ground and made clay and had him go wash at the pool of Siloam because of the name of the pool. And it has significance to the whole point of this story, which is Jesus is the sent one. And so we even see that in John 4, this concept, this idea of him being sent, which we'll talk about as we go further in the story. So all this to make the point of the importance of the narrator. So what I'd like to do is go back and just sort of take each of those paragraphs that we read, and just I want you guys to, I'll ask each of you maybe to give input on what do you see in the paragraph that seems significant from the narrator. All right, we're just going to focus on the narrator. We've already focused on Christ, on the disciples, Samaritans, the Samaritan woman. Now we want to give attention to the narrator, and here just focusing in on what statements he makes that seems important or significant to the story at this point of our study. Okay, so BJ, I think you read the first 6 verses, so we'll start with you. Just, is there anything in these first 6 verses that the narrator says that seems important?
Yes, sir. I'm seeing that in verse 4, he mentioned that he had to pass through Samaria. He had to pass.
Yes, there seems to be a sense of mission or purpose here, doesn't there?
Yes, sir.
So yeah, it didn't say simply that he passed through Samaria. It says he had to pass through Samaria. I think in the Greek text, the word there is it was necessary. Yeah, for him, this idea he had to do it. So, which, by the way, that word, it is necessary, or he had to, that word appears quite often in John's gospel, by the way. Anyway, okay, anything else that sticks out to you as significant from the narrator here? Most these 6 verses are all narrator at this point. He's setting up the story, introducing it. Anything else?
In verse 1, Pastor Tim, I also see that the narrator mentions the Pharisees.
Yes. Yeah. Now, think about that in light of this story. Why might that be? How might that be connected or important potentially?
Pharisees are always depicted, sir, as self-righteous, and we see here in this chapter that Jesus or God has included the Samaritans only by grace. They are not worthy but because of the grace of God, the mercy of God, they have been included in the salvation plan.
Yeah, certainly the Pharisees were very much different than the Samaritans. The Samaritans were humble and seeking God, but the Pharisees were not. Think about in terms of what was the impetus or reason for Jesus going up to Galilee? What does the narrator say here?
He left Judea and departed again for Galilee. So this is not his first time going through that place.
Okay, so he left Judea, he went into Galilee, but what was it that prompted him to leave Judea? Why didn't he stay?
Because the Pharisees heard that he was making and baptizing more disciples than John.
Correct. And so what's the implication? Why would that prompt him, you think, to leave? You would think if he's making more disciples, if he's baptizing, then actually things are going pretty well. So why would he leave?
They were out to get him.
Yeah, we see here the sort of the implication of the hostility of them towards Christ, right? And the antagonism. And remember, how might that be significant? One, John tells us, because that's the change in setting, right? He gives us the reason Jesus left, but he could have just said Jesus went to Judea. Okay? I mean, as far as this story is concerned, again, remember, leave no comment unquestioned by the narrator. You always got to ask yourself, what's he doing here? And does this have some important connection to the story? That may not be obvious until later as you're studying the story. That's why on several steps, I have you come back and look at the narrator. But here in this story, he could have started in verse 3, right? He could have just said, okay, Jesus is on his way. He's going up to Galilee now, and he had to pass through Samaria. And then we get into the story. But he puts verses 1 and 2 there. All right, he gives us the reason Jesus left. Now, we're not always told that in the Gospels. Sometimes it's just Jesus moving along. But here we are specifically given the reason. And the reason has to do with the Pharisees, all right, that they'd heard he's baptizing more disciples. And from what we know of the Pharisees, right, then that probably wasn't, they were probably giving Jesus some pressure or it wasn't a positive thing. We'll say it that way. And so as you think about it, might that have some link or connection to this story? More than just, it's what prompted Jesus to leave Judea. You guys have any thoughts?
Well, the Pharisees served as a foil, as we will later on see.
Yeah.
To the Samaritans. The Pharisees being the religious leaders, while the Samaritans being the despised ones. Their reactions to the Lord were complete opposites. So
yeah, they're completely opposite from the Samaritans' reaction, right? And remember, there's this cultural prejudice that hangs over this story. There's this antagonism between Jew and Samaritan, especially between the Jewish leaders and the Samaritans, right? That they wouldn't even, no Levite, no Pharisee or Levite would be found dead, going through Samaria. They would shake the dust off their feet if they ever touched Samaritan soil. I mean, so the fact that Jesus not only goes to Samaria, but has this interaction with a Samaritan woman and the Samaritans, and that he brings a message, of salvation to them. Well, these would be just drive the Pharisees crazy. And so I think this is intentional, that John, he's kind of throwing in here, the hint of the Pharisees. It's kind of like back in John chapter 1, where the Pharisees, remember, it says the Pharisees went, that they were there at the Jordan, and that they were the ones that went to John and asked him if he was the one. Remember that? And again, background context, the Gospel of John was the fourth gospel written. Certainly there would be some familiarity in John's audience with these Pharisees from the previous gospels, right? It's likely they already knew these guys were not good guys. So I think John here is sort of, as he's giving us the setting of this story, he's kind of like throwing it in the background here of those Pharisees and their attitudes towards Jesus, and their attitudes towards, who said it earlier? Was that, I forget if it was BJ or not, right? The Pharisees are self-righteous, right? They're bigots, they're racists, they're arrogant, they reject the Messiah. So they're kind of looming in the background of this story, and I think John is intentionally sort of bringing them in that background sort of way. Because, like I said, he could have started the story here, and it wouldn't have, it would have seemed fine, right? That Jesus was in Judea and he left and went back up into Galilee. But he includes those two verses. Always ask, why did he do that? And is that significant? Just like BJ pointed out, when it says here in the text, that Jesus had to pass through Samaria.
Tim.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I think there is also some significance in the first two verses in describing Jesus making and baptizing more disciples, and because of the opposition of the Pharisees, it's like Jesus was forced to be driven away from that work of making disciples. But then the irony of it all is, because he had to pass through Samaria, he ended up with, again, more disciples, or followers or believers, through the person of the Samaritans.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I think it's interesting as well that, later we'll see in the story, right, where Jesus has to get the disciples' attention about the mission that they've been sent on. And I think it's kind of ironic in verse 2, they were active in the ministry in Judea, right? They're participating in the ministry. In fact, it says Jesus didn't baptize, it was the disciples doing that. He delegated that responsibility to them. So they're participating in his work. And yet here, Jesus has to tell them, right? Later in verse, look, guys, here, right? Look, guys, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish this work. Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes, look on the field, they are white. So I think it's kind of interesting that, they were fine. They were active in the ministry when they're among their own people. But did they really get a sense of the mission, that it extended beyond Judea, beyond Israel? So again, don't want to read too much into these things, but at the same time, they're not, the narrator doesn't just throw things in that are random thoughts. That there is some connection, there is some reason. Sometimes it's significant, sometimes it's not. Sometimes he might just give information that's helpful to filling out the setting of the story and giving us a picture of what was going on. But here, because this is a purpose statement, right? When the Lord knew, he left Judea. So this is a purpose statement. So that carries some significance. Keep your eye out for those kinds of things as you go through a story. Okay. All right. Anything else, BJ or anybody, on these first 6 verses that seem significant to the story from what the narrator says?
Pastor Tim, one more. I'm
Yeah.
also observing the narrator mentioned Old Testament characters like Jacob and Joseph.
Yeah. And certainly the Samaritans would share in that history with the Jews, right? The Samaritans, there weren't Samaritans until really, the Assyrian exile.
Right.
So before that, Samaria was just a part of the 10 northern tribes. And before that, it was a part of, unified Israel. And so they shared, Jacob and Joseph were part of their heritage too. And there is, a focus by the narrator on a specific location where they were at. Again, you have to ask yourself, why would the narrator give us this degree of detail as to their location? What is the significance of that? What is the significance of it into this story even? Because again, it's more than just, if he had said, if he had just said this, so he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, okay, that would be enough to give us the setting, but he adds a specific place in Samaria. So again, something to consider and think about in relation to the story. Okay. All right, let's look at the next paragraph here. I forgot who read this one. Was that you, Renee?
Yes, Pastor.
All right, well, so we'll start with you, give you a chance. What are anything in here the narrator says that seems significant? Now, from here to verse 25, it's mostly dialogue. There's not a lot of narrator comments. But are there any here that the narrator gives that seem important?
Pastor Tim, in verse 9, the narrator identifies or tells us the problem or the prejudice among the Jews with the Samaritans. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.
Yes. Again, very subtle, and it's in parentheses in English. That's means that the translators see this as a side comment, but it's, I think, one of the most significant comments in the whole story, because I believe it's revealing, here's the problem in the story. Jesus is basically, talking to this Samaritan woman. That's a big, that's a major issue. And just to make sure nobody misses it who's reading the story, if they don't know the whole background between the Jews and Samaritans, John makes sure to say, look, this was a problem. And even the woman notes that. How come you're talking to me? I'm a Samaritan woman and you're a Jew. So not only in the woman's statement, but John wants to make sure we don't miss the issue here. Really not any other comments. I mean, he mentions, the Samaritan woman coming to draw water. So that is, important in regards to just the, introducing this character to the story. But other than that, really not a lot else here, right?
Yes.
So you got it easy, Renee. Anything, do you have any other thoughts or comments on this?
None, Pastor Tim.
Okay. Anybody else before we go to the next?
Pastor,
Yeah.
does it mean that John was with our Lord Jesus Christ?
Oh, at this point?
Yes.
Well, it says his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food in verse 8, right?
Yes, Pastor. But since the narrator was, if John was the narrator, does it mean that he was with Jesus?
Yeah, I think what seems to be the case is he was not, because in verse 8 and then later in the story, the disciples return and they're surprised to see him talking. So either Jesus later told John what happened in their dialogue, or the Spirit just revealed it to him as he was writing this account. But I believe Jesus was alone with this woman. But that's a good question. All right. The next paragraph, I think was it Tabs? Did you read this one? You see anything here?
Yes, Pastor. Yes, Pastor. I don't see any narrator comments, Pastor.
No, he just inserts the dialogue. Jesus said,
No, Pastor, it's
the
made up
woman
mostly
said,
of dialogue.
he said, yeah, but no real Jesus said. So yeah, you got it easy too. Nothing here to report really of significance. So let's move on to the next. I don't think he says much in this one either. Ence, did you read this one?
Yes, Pastor. It's more really also an exchange between the woman and Jesus. But somehow it's so surprising how the woman really was was anticipating of the coming Messiah, and Jesus just revealing who he is to her.
Yeah.
And a lot of things about God and how to worship, things like that.
Yeah. And I think we talked about this before, but just think of the significance of what Jesus is telling this Samaritan woman. I mean, this is among the most significant statements on worship in Scripture. And he's telling it to this Samaritan woman out in a well, just the two of them. Right? None of the other Gospels talked about this. Certainly there's other passages that relate to worship in the Bible, but this is one of the most direct and clearest statements where Jesus says, look, it's not going to be a place that's significant. It's going to be the worship happening between the worshipers and the Father directly, right? That will worship him in spirit and truth. It won't be just focused on a location. I mean, and then he says, that where is it? The Father seeks, that he's actually seeking a certain person. And ultimately, what is it that God wants? What is it he deserves?
Worship.
Right? Worship.
Sir?
Yeah.
just are women more worshipers than men then?
Maybe that's why. Makes you wonder. Yeah, again, why Jesus said this. Like I said, guys, I think this woman gets misunderstood. I've heard a number of sermons on this passage, and I think this woman gets misunderstood. You know, she's often seen as, you know, trying to change the subject here, or she's uncomfortable, so she doesn't want to talk about her personal life anymore. So I honestly think, guys, it hits her like, wow, this guy is somebody unique. So I really want to understand this question. I think this guy can answer it. I mean, I think she really wanted to know. And she finally came across somebody that she felt could tell her. That's why Jesus gives this profound declaration of worship to her, I think. That's my opinion. But again, you know, I think if she was trying to dodge the issue, I don't think Jesus would have responded this way. Honestly, right? I don't think he would have. He answered her question.
Yeah.
And you know, it's quite amazing. And then, of course, obviously, in the next paragraph, there's not much here as far as narrator. The next paragraph, she says, I know Messiah is coming. I mean, there's a messianic hope that this woman has. This lady is quite impressive as far as someone seeking, you know, and she immediately responds when Jesus tells her directly, I'm the Messiah. How often did he do that? Yeah. And then, of course, she believes it. And so she immediately goes and goes into the city to tell the others. Okay, so this paragraph, anything significant from the narrator? Was Harris, did you read this one? I forgot.
It's me, Pastor.
Oh, sorry, Jason. Go ahead.
In verse 25, Pastor, the inclusion there, the one who the description about the Messiah, the statement, he who is called Christ.
Yeah.
So there was a reference to the Old Testament Messiah, which is called Christ, basically the anointed one.
Yeah, so it's the Greek translation of anointed one. That's the Greek equivalent of the Old Testament word Mashiach, you know, Messiah. So here, you know, he clarifies to the Greek-speaking audience who potentially then may have been Gentiles. He clarifies that. So good. Anything else that you see?
Sorry, in verse 27, the timing of the disciples coming in, just to intensify the conflict between the culture and the prevalent culture and the expectation of or the ministry of Jesus.
Yeah, because they note here they're amazed that he had been speaking with a woman. So again, I think pointing out the cultural prejudice and bias that even existed among them. So I think verse 27, the narrator again puts in this comment to highlight that particular issue, just as he did back in verse 9, where he gave that statement about Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Anything else, Jason, that seems significant to the story here from the narrator?
The reaction of the woman, Pastor, in verse 28. Again, this is the contrast of the woman's reaction to what she heard from Jesus versus the prevailing perception of the disciples. The woman left her water pot, and then she testified about Jesus Christ. So there's the comparison between, again, the perspective and the reaction of the woman.
Yeah. Many people have, questioned, is there significance to that statement that she left her water pot and went into the city? And I think it, to me, it might just indicate her excitement. That, because that was the whole reason she went to the well. was to get water, right?
Mm.
And so the only thing that she was going to carry the water in was the water pot. And yet it seems like to me, she's so excited. She just, leaves the pot there and runs into the city to tell the people she'd seen the Messiah. Right?
Mm.
So I think, again, it's often hard to know for sure because the author doesn't tell us explicitly. She left her water pot because, but if you look at what she did, I think that points to, Jesus just said, I'm the Messiah. And disciples show up at that moment. She leaves her water pot, goes to the city. Why? Because she wanted to tell the people there she'd seen the Messiah. And again, remember this statement. I think I explained to you before that, there's a way you can ask questions in Greek where it's not a question, it's really a statement, but it's given in the form of a question. So I think that's what we see here. She's not wondering, I wonder if this is the Christ. No, she's saying that, is this not the Christ? Would probably be a better way to say that in English.
Yeah.
So
A rhetorical question.
yeah. So yeah, I think the water pot might be a helpful or it's not, maybe I don't want to say significant statement, but it's not unimportant. I'll put it that way, because I think it does reveal her own excitement and that's sort of kind of the contrast that gets set up is how the woman responds to Jesus and her heart to reach out and be part of his mission, and the disciples not so much, at least not with the Samaritans. So anything else, Jason, or anybody else that you guys see that seems important from the narrator?
Pastor,
Pastor, this is Gary.
Yeah, hi Gary.
I going back to Pastor Atom's question earlier.
Yeah.
Given the details of the conversation, so I was thinking, John was able to. How was John was able to record the details of the conversation up to this point? Or either Jesus really tell him, or the Samaritan woman told him the details of this conversation, or either John is here. I don't know.
I think those are two good possibilities. I mean, if you notice, right? I'm sorry, Gary, did I cut you off? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
Go ahead. I didn't mean to.
No, I was just wondering. It's either the Lord Jesus Christ told him the details, or the Samaritan woman told him the details of this detailed conversation that she had with Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, there's only three possibilities here, because again, it appears John wasn't there; he's with the disciples. So either Jesus told him, the Samaritan woman told him, or the Spirit just revealed it to him at some point. But remember, they spent. It says in verse 40 that they stayed with the Samaritans for 2 days. Now you have to imagine, again, it's not said, so we can't be certain, but you've got to imagine that his conversation with this woman was discussed.
Okay, all right.
Either by Jesus or by her, right? I mean, just picture, they come into this town. She was the center point of it because, right, she's the one that brought Jesus to them, so to speak. She's the one that, so, I mean, you can imagine, because remember too, notice it says they were saying to the woman, it's no longer because of what you said we believe. So I think she related their conversation to the people there. And certainly the disciples would have, caught some of that, I would imagine, or Jesus, he often would give them instruction. He could have said something, or, again, even the Holy Spirit could have revealed it as well. But I think they probably just heard about it through the interactions in the town there when they stayed there for a couple days. I mean, that'd be the most kind of natural or normal, I think, right? I mean, I don't know, you guys have any other thoughts or ideas about that?
Or it could just have been simply the Holy Spirit as he guided John as one of the writers of the scriptures
Yeah.
and revealed it to him. There's
Yeah.
just so many details that John has in his gospel that are not in the other gospel. So it could just have been the Holy Spirit. So
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, there's three possibilities, and it could be a combination, right? I mean, he could remember some things too, and as he's writing them down, perhaps any gaps or things that he's forgotten, maybe the Spirit prompted. It's that whole process of inspiration that is involved here too. So, yeah, any of those are possibilities. I think from a human side, my guess would be he probably heard about much of it through the time they spent there, the city, because you can imagine people were asking her, what did Jesus tell you, what happened, and all of that. So okay, so there's a few things here from the narrator. Let's go to the next section that was read, and this one was this Atong, did you read this one? Who read, or Harris? I forgot who read this.
Yeah, I read it, Pastor Tim.
Okay.
There's not much, Pastor Tim, except that the narrator introduces their statements. But I think the first one where the disciples urged him. In this passage, I see the narrator emphasizes the humanity of Christ. Like when he got tired, he thirsted, he hungered, and the disciples had to urge him to eat. And I think it aligns with John's purpose of proving that Jesus Christ is God who came to God who was made flesh. And the Word was made flesh and he dwelt among us. Because, as you have said last time, the Gnostics were attacking already the humanity as well as the deity of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah, certainly we have statements made throughout the gospel that direct us to the incarnation here. Other than that, I mean, maybe the disciples speaking to one another about Jesus' statement. So narrator showing us the disciples, or again, we're not, they weren't getting the spiritual significance here, what was going on. But most of this is pretty much dialogue. Jesus really giving instruction actually to the disciples, instruction that I believe is at the heart of the point of this story too, but we'll come back to that. We will come back to that. Right now we're just focused on the narrator. Last section, I think this was a tongue, right?
Yes, Pastor.
Okay, anything from the narrator that you see here?
In verse 39, Pastor, the result of Christ's encounter with the Samaritan woman when she came to the city, already sharing what happened to her when she told her very experience with our Lord Jesus Christ, and the desire of the Samaritans to see our Lord Jesus Christ. In verse 40, Pastor, the Samaritans already decided to join the woman to see Jesus Christ, and they asked Jesus to stay with them, which led to many converts. It was also a testimony of what Christ is talking about, sowing and reaping to the disciples.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. This is a demonstration of that, the harvest,
Pastor.
right?
Mm.
And notice,
Mm.
right, they were in contrast to the Pharisees. Again, go back to the first verse. The Pharisees found out he was baptized, he was becoming popular. And so the implication there is Jesus wasn't ready for the confrontation yet. He wasn't afraid, but he knew that it wasn't in the Father's timing. So he left. But here the Samaritans, they're like, hey, we want you to stay here. We want to learn more from you. So the contrast there, right? That somebody mentioned earlier. And then of course, verse 41, many more believed. Again, that word believed is one of the key words in the gospel, right? It's mentioned here, the Samaritans believed, many more believed. They said it is no longer because of what you said, we believe. Okay. So here that links us into the purpose of the gospel, right? That you would know Jesus is the, you guys remember?
Savior of the world.
The Christ, the
Christ.
Son of the living God, and that believing you may have life in his name, right? Well, that's exactly what we see transpire here. They come to know Jesus is the Christ, and they believe. So here John's giving us a story where shows us the very purpose of the book, that to reveal Christ, who he is, so that the reader would believe and receive eternal life. Well, here, that's exactly what happened to the Samaritans. All right, so that's sort of the broad message in the story, but within that, it's who believed and how that came about. That's the significance in this story. Okay, any other thoughts about the narrator from this or anything else in the account that comes to your mind?
Yeah, Tim.
Yeah.
I think there's some significance too in what the narrator said in verse 39, in comparison to what he said in verse 41. When many believed in him because of the word of the woman, and then in verse 41, many believed because of his word. I think there's some significance there because for some reason, John did not discount the importance of the woman testifying. No, her testifying actually prepared them to hear the word of Christ, the living word. So from the testimony of the woman, the people were led to be interested to hear the word himself. And I think there is some significance there in the sense that we could say that there is use for our testifying of Christ to others, but our testimony must lead people to really turn to the word as the final testimony. It's not our testimony, but what the word says. So I see some significance in the comparison between those two verses.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Also, Pastor, can you go back to the can you show again Pastor, can you show again the verse
screen
or the passage?
Yeah.
Screen.
But who is that, Tom? We have to answer that question first. You better show your face at Tong, guys. Okay,
I
there
am
he is.
Atong.
Pastor, if I
Hi.
may say something on.
Okay, I'm sorry, Gary.
Oh,
Go ahead.
on the verse on verse 40. And it says the narrative there that they were asking him to stay with them. So here you can see the eagerness also of the Samaritans. And Jesus actually answered them, and he stayed there for 2 days, like what we mentioned earlier on the first verses, wherein the eagerness also of the woman to converse with the Lord Jesus Christ. And here we can see that the Lord Jesus Christ is someone who really wanted to reveal himself to those who wanted to know him.
Yeah.
As it
Yeah, that's
says there.
good. I think you're right, Gary. There's just this real emphasis here on the Samaritans welcoming Jesus, wanting to hear from Jesus, eager to listen to him, their response to Jesus. I mean, these guys are, it's like the perfect like account, as far as this is exactly what John wishes for everyone. But these guys are again, these are the Samaritans. They're the most responsive people in the whole gospel. Positive response, right?
Yeah.
We could even argue this story, this is the most responsive group in all the gospels to Jesus. Right? I mean, can you think of another group? I mean, there are individuals, of course, but this is it seems like most of the town of Samaritans, of all people. What a contrast, because it's no accident that right after this story, we have John 5, 6, 7, all the way through 12, which is story after story of the rejection of Jesus by the Pharisees, by the other Jewish people, and hostile rejection. So, that we haven't seen that yet explicitly. We've seen, implicitly, like in verse 1, we see sort of the mention of the Pharisees and a little bit of a negative connotation there, right? That Jesus left because they heard he was making more disciples, but there's nothing overt and explicit till we get to chapter 5, when they were saying, tell us, by whose authority are you saying these things? Right? There's just outright direct rejection. Well, but just before that, we have these wonderful Samaritans who are just the example of a genuine, response in faith to the Lord Jesus. Just, I mean, again, I don't think we can. I don't know if there's a modern example we could give that would express, at least here in the States, we might. I don't know if it would be. Can't think of a good analogy, but it's just like this group of people, of all groups of people, to have this profound response to Christ is, really is stunning. It would be, just stunning and unbelievable to that culture. And like I said, I think this is the most, the greatest response to Christ anywhere in the Gospels, as far as a group of people responding. Certainly at Pentecost, I mean, there was a response, but that was after Jesus left. So so good point, Gary. I think there's an emphasis here by the narrator just on the eagerness, the acceptance, the openness to Jesus as the Messiah. It's great. That's a great story, man. It's a great story.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
There's so many elements here. Yeah, Robbie.
Yeah. If we could go back to verse 34. I think this story is not just the Lord ministering to the Samaritan woman, but really to his disciples. Because it seems like, especially with the narrator comment that the Jews did not deal with the Samaritans, with the Lord actually saying, "My food is to do the will of Him who sent me and to accomplish His work." I think that the Lord really here was ministering to His disciples who seemed to have been on break just because they were in this territory right now, and this whole account is really for the later readers of the Lord to show that His ministry continues to other people as well, even people who many might be prejudiced against. His ministry to them really does not stop. And I think He was speaking this to His disciples to tell them that, hey, wherever we go, there is always this opportunity to do the work of the gospel. And it just so happened here that the woman, the Samaritans, really serve as a beautiful testimony of the response to the ministry of Christ. And this should have spoken tons to the disciples later on when they realize, yeah, this is a harvest that's ready to be reaped, and we've just been ignoring this. And I think the Lord passing here was also greatly for the purpose of ministering to the disciples, starting from verse 34. I think that's the whole point He was trying to make here as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think I made comment a moment ago about just, if you take, if these verses weren't here, then well, including we'd have to also include 37 and 38, right? Because He says, "I sent you to reap." So if these verses weren't here, and we just go from here, I'm going to do what Thomas Jefferson did. He took out the, let's see, how do we want to do this? Here, let me do this. Give me a second. Let me rearrange a couple things here. Okay. So if we if we just had this, all right, if it went from 30 to 39, 31 to 38 were not there, this story would be all about basically the Samaritans coming to believe.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the whole issue about the problem, and everything wouldn't be as acute. But we have these verses here, 31 to 38, which I think reveal the point of the story. It's not just the Samaritans coming to Christ. It's that, look, you disciples missed it. Look at these people. They are so receptive right now. But as Gary said, they're eager. They're eager to receive me, to receive the salvation. It's been handed to you guys. And you've missed it. I mean, of course, I'm paraphrasing here. I think this is, I'm jumping way ahead on this, guys, but I think this passage is really a Great Commission text to us. And I think it is particularly important, especially in my country right now, with all of the racial tension going on. I mean, there's issues all over the world. There's racism, tribalism all over the world, okay? But this text applies even more specifically to that context where the gospel should be going everywhere, and there should be no person on this earth that we are ignoring when it comes to the Great Commission. That there should be there's no person on this earth that is beneath us or unworthy of us to bring the gospel. And I think that this story draws that out, because again, of all the people in those days, it's the Samaritans that respond the way they do. And even in spite of the bias against the pressure against Jesus to even be talking to them, he does anyway, because he's on a mission. I have food that you don't know about. My food is to do the will of him who sent me. That's why I'm here, guys. And oh, by the way, I sent you. Now, and so that's why I think the woman here is a foil to the disciples, in that she went, Jesus didn't tell her to go, right? He didn't commission her, okay, now that you believe, go tell the city. She just did it. But the disciples here, they're like, right? And of course, we can identify, I think, we need to be prompted ourselves to recognize the mission. It's easy to forget. It's easy to, especially reaching out to people like, Muslims and those who it's hard. We have to remember that there's no person that is not worthy for us to bring the gospel. So this story has so much importance on many different levels. But I think, like I said, I believe by John including these verses on Jesus's dialogue with the disciples really reveals a significant part of what he is after. And so when we get to scene analysis and sort of, I think, see this develop and then the plot, so I'm really jumping ahead here, but Robbie, you made a good point. So I just wanted to sort of follow up with that. So these verses are very important to this story. All right, anything else as far as the narrator comment, or just any comment in general, question in general about what we talked about to this point? You can see with these stories, the way we analyze the details, it's a little different than like with epistles, right? Epistles are sort of laid out, so the diagram kind of helps us see the details and the connections. With a story, it's different, because we have to kind of see, the story has links all throughout the story. And so it's that's what's challenging with trying to understand the point of a story, because you'll have comments made at one part of the story that may not seem that important until you understand better what the story's about. Or you may not understand what the story's about, but then there are these comments that are made, especially by the narrator, that can help guide and direct us as to what he's wanting us to see. But it's kind of this interaction. And so you may not, at the character analysis level, none of this may be apparent to you, it may not be till, you get later on, maybe in the scene analysis, and it's like something clicks, like, oh, I see maybe why John said this now, or, but here's the thing, guys, I'm trying to give you some practical steps so to just sort of force you to look at things from a different angle, and always be asking why, why is this here? That is the exegete's most important question. And it needs to be a constant one, and you may not be able to answer that right away, because it's the familiarity with the story that will help you, and sort of looking at it from these different doing this analysis of different parts of the story, the scenes, the plot, the characters, the setting, even the making observations at the very beginning of when we go through the story. Those are all important elements to, as you get more familiar with the story, you'll be able to see more things. So don't presume, just like the block diagram, you're not going to get the diagram right on the first pass. I mean, it just won't happen. But you start, and then, you know, as you get more familiar with the passage, then you might get other insights as you go a long way. But it's one of the steps in the process to help get you into the text, looking for certain things and forcing you to look for certain things to think about in a particular way. And so that's the same with this. And so I go back to the narrator in several of the steps, because I am convinced that it's a very important, he plays a very important role in understanding the story, and because he's the author. So it's what he wants us to see that's important. And that's not always obvious. He doesn't tell us, like, you know, most of the stories, they don't have like, okay, here, I want to tell you a story about the importance of sharing the gospel to anyone. You know, he doesn't tell us up front or at the end, like, his point. We have to induce it. It's inductive. We have to figure out what's going on in the story and how each of the elements fit, and then its purpose shows itself. So, well, why don't we stop here? I think this is a good point to stop. We'll pick up and look at the setting next time we get together, next week, Lord willing. And unless there's any other comments or questions, thoughts that come to your mind, Robbie?
Yeah, maybe since we're talking about narratives, and you had mentioned about these details made from narrators' comments. I think there's a little difference when you look at the narratives of the gospel, which many times are not in sequence chronologically. It's a little different. The experience is a little different when you do an Old Testament narrative, like I'm doing First Samuel as a series now for the Sunday pulpit. And again, it's so important. I find myself realizing that certain details in the previous chapter you need to refer to as you're tackling present passage in another chapter in the following chapter. And I would find myself having to refer to details that were mentioned even 3, 4, 5 chapters before. So that what is being discussed in that particular segment, present segment, makes more sense or becomes more clear. So in one sense, it's a little harder when you do a chronologically true narrative, because you can't just disregard what had happened in earlier chapters sometimes. And that takes time to just go back and look for what happened 3, 4 chapters before. Anyway, just wanted to make that comment.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it you know, these stories are not in isolation. And we often preach them in isolation, and we have to be careful we don't do that, because you got to understand, you know, how is the story connected to what he said before and even what he's said after. Because the Samuel is one long story. It's not a bunch of short stories that are just collected together. It's one story. And so you have the pieces of, you know, you have smaller stories, but that makes up part of the whole story. And you have to, you're exactly right. You've got to keep that in mind. You know, this story has some connection to other stories, or it may be setting up something later.
Right.
And you can't overlook that. And I think so often this is what makes narratives, hard to preach, because so often we just look for the theological and doctrinal principles in these stories instead of telling the story. So we might see, the sovereignty of God in a particular story. Certainly that's a truth. Certainly that's an important doctrine, but it may not be the truth that the author's wanting to focus on. He's just, God did a certain thing, but his focus is on something else, like David and Goliath. Certainly God gave David the victory in that story, but that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is, this is what God's man looks like in contrast to the world. Saul, he's the so yeah, I think that's a very important point, Robbie, that and that's why we have to read through the whole book and get familiar with the whole book. But sometimes, you're going to be going along and it's like it's going to hit you as you study one story, like, oh, I wonder if there's a link back over here, or he keeps bringing up this particular point. Or sometimes you just won't get, like in Samuel, when he says he rebukes Samuel for what was the oldest brother's name? Eliab, was it? I forget.
Just later on.
When Samuel was like, oh, this must be the guy, and God says, don't look at the outside. God, I look at the heart.
Yeah.
That's a significant statement in the whole first half of Samuel. Because the whole point is, this is the kind of man God wants. Saul was the kind of man the people wanted. And so, so there could be, you could have a few stories where really they're setting up another one later. So they're just part of a bigger story that has a point. It's like in the Joseph narrative, right? Genesis 37 to 50. You have to take that as a whole. You can't break out pieces until you understand the whole story. And then how does each of those acts, act 1, act 2, act 3, that's how the Joseph narrative is broken up. But each of those acts contribute to the whole story, which is, God meant it for good, to preserve life. So you got to figure out, okay, what is the extent of this narrative? How does it fit in the bigger narrative of the book? And maybe there's a string of stories that are meant to be connected together to make a particular point, as with Genesis 37 to 50. And Genesis 37 to 50, right, is God's sovereign hand in preserving the life of the family of Jacob through Joseph. But that's part of the bigger picture of God preserving the family of Abraham to keep his promise to Abraham. Right? The Abrahamic covenant is central to the Pentateuch. It's central to the Bible, honestly. But it's central as far as stories are concerned, right? The Pentateuch is one narrative, one book. So Genesis 12 and the calling of Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, is really a central part of that whole book. And then its connection to then the Mosaic covenant, which is what is central to the Pentateuch, as well as the rest of the Old Testament, honestly. So anyway, thank you, Robbie. That's a very important point. How does this story connect to what's around it, to the purpose of the book, to that's what makes it hard, especially if you choose a big book like Samuel. Or John, the Gospel of John. I mean, that's a big book. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you. I want to let you guys go for lunch. Robbie, can I just had a quick question for you, if I could ask it once we're done.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Ance, you want to close us in prayer?
Sure, Pastor.